I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew which kid belonged to which family and gossip traveled faster than the school bus. My dad, Franklin Donovan, was a retired soldier who believed his house was just another extension of the barracks. My mom, Joanne, was the opposite, gentle, patient, and the only reason our home didn't feel like a permanent inspection line. And then there was Valerie, my older sister, the golden child who could do no wrong. If Valerie brought home a trophy from a track meet, Dad made sure it sat in the living room for everyone to see. If I brought home an A in math, he'd glance at it like it was a receipt and mutter, "That's what you're supposed to do." Valerie was tall, strong, loud, and always the center of attention. I was quiet, short for my age, and apparently invisible unless someone needed to make a comparison. At family dinners, Dad would go on about how Valerie had leadership qualities, while I was just responsible. Responsible in his tone didn't mean reliable, it meant boring. Valerie didn't waste a second cashing in on it either. She'd smirk across the table and say things like, "Maybe Ray can organize the napkins since she loves details so much." Dad would laugh. Mom would cut her eyes at him, but never call him out. She'd change the subject, and later, when it was just me helping with dishes, she'd squeeze my shoulder and say, "Being steady counts more than being loud." By the time Valerie was old enough to join the Army National Guard, the whole town was cheering her on. Dad threw her a send-off barbecue, complete with a giant banner strung across the yard that said, "Our hero." People showed up with potato salad and lawn chairs. When Valerie came back from her short deployment overseas, folks acted like she'd won the war on her own. She'd stroll into the local diner, and people would stand up to shake her hand. Meanwhile, I was just Ray, the little sister, the quiet one, the one who, in my father's eyes, never measured up. He liked to introduce us with, "This is Valerie, my soldier. And this is Ray. She reads a lot." He thought it was funny. It wasn't. The lowest point for me came one Thanksgiving when relatives packed the house, and Dad decided to toast Valerie. He raised his glass and said, "To Valerie, who made us proud by serving, and to Ray, who, well, maybe one day she'll figure out what she's good at." Everyone chuckled, thinking it was lighthearted. I sat there with a fake smile plastered on my face, gripping my fork so tight it left an imprint in my palm. Valerie never missed a chance to rub it in. She'd lean over and whisper, "Don't take it personal, Ray. Some of us are just built for more." Her smirk burned into my memory that night. I didn't say a word. I didn't throw the fork, I didn't yell back. But inside, I promised myself I'd prove every single one of them wrong. My mom was the only one who believed in me, though she never went against Dad openly. When I told her I was thinking about applying to the Naval Academy, she smiled in a way that said she knew this was coming. "If anyone can handle it, you can," she told me quietly in the kitchen. "Not because you're like Valerie, because you're not." That stuck with me. When Dad overheard, he laughed. "The Navy? Ray, they'll eat you alive. You'll quit by the first month. Don't embarrass yourself." Valerie piled on. "You'll be crying for Mom after the first push-up." That night, I filled out the application under the glow of a desk lamp while they sat in the living room watching TV. I wasn't going to let them dictate who I was anymore. Even before Annapolis, the comparisons didn't stop. Valerie strutted around town in her guard uniform, medals pinned proudly, while I was the kid bagging groceries for extra money. People would pat her on the back and glance at me with polite pity. My dad ate it up. He'd sit at the diner and tell people, "Valerie saved lives in uniform." If someone asked about me, he'd shrug, "Raise? Studying or something." Mom kept me grounded. She'd slide notes into my lunch bag when I was in high school, short quotes, reminders that I mattered. Sometimes they were silly jokes, sometimes pieces of poems. "Don't run from storms, learn to fly through them," one said. I didn't understand it fully then, but it would become something I carried for years. The worst public humiliation came at a family reunion when I was 17. Valerie was already in uniform, and people gathered around her asking questions about the guard. Someone turned to me and asked, "So Ray, what about you? Planning to follow in your sister's footsteps?" Before I could answer, Valerie laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Generals don't waste time on girls like Ray. She'd get lost on the way to basic." The crowd chuckled nervously, waiting to see if Dad would correct her. He didn't. He laughed too. That moment cut deeper than anything before. I could see relatives trying to look away, pretending it was all harmless fun. But it wasn't. That night, I locked myself in my room and stared at the Naval Academy application packet. Valerie thought she'd won. Dad thought I was just a background character in Valerie's story. I knew then I'd have to burn through every ounce of doubt, every sneer, every joke they threw at me. I didn't yell, I didn't storm out. I started building the version of myself that no one expected. If my sister was the family's golden soldier, I was going to be the shadow they never saw coming. The night after that reunion, I grabbed a pen and filled out every line of the Naval Academy application like I was carving it into stone. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the thought of my dad's face when he found out. I didn't ask for his approval, and I sure as hell didn't tell Valerie. When the acceptance letter came months later, I opened it alone in the kitchen. The words, "Appointed to the United States Naval Academy," sat at the top, and I felt my chest tighten. I wasn't smiling. I was steady, the way Mom always told me to be. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope before Dad walked in. Of course, Valerie got to it first. She found the envelope on the counter and read it out loud like she was announcing a joke to the whole family. "Ray? At Annapolis? What's next, valedictorian of push-ups?" Dad chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll quit before you even unpack. Mark my words." Mom stood in the doorway with folded arms, staring at Dad, but she didn't argue. She just gave me that same steady look, the one that meant, prove them wrong. The day I arrived at Annapolis, the heat felt like it was crawling under my skin. Plebe summer was designed to break people, and I could see why. The upperclassmen screamed until their voices cracked, and we were just sweaty, stumbling kids trying to figure out which way was up. Valerie had told me once, "They'll eat you alive." That line replayed in my head as I got shoved into line, barked at for moving too slow, and nearly passed out from holding my rifle wrong. I was never the fastest, never the strongest. I failed my first run and came in near the bottom on pull-ups. The only thing I had was this stubborn streak that wouldn't let me quit. I learned quickly that what I lacked in speed, I could make up for in precision. While others rushed through drills, I memorized every step, every instruction. I wrote things down at night when no one was looking, building little checklists that kept me from making the same mistake twice. That first week, a kid in my squad forgot to secure his weapon during inspection. The whole squad got punished push-ups until our arms gave out. The next night, I quietly made a list for our squad and taped it inside the locker. Weapon check, uniform check, bootlaces, bed corners. A couple of guys laughed at it, called me Mom. But the next inspection, we passed. No push-ups. After that, no one laughed. They just started adding to the list. By the end of plebe summer, I was still not the strongest, but people noticed I didn't crack. The instructors noticed too. One of them muttered to another, "She's boring, but she gets it done." I pretended not to hear, but inside, I knew I'd found my niche. Back home, Valerie was making the rounds at community events, telling anyone who'd listen about her guard days. She posted photos in uniform at every parade, shaking hands with veterans like she was running for office. Dad ate it up, bragging about her deployments at the diner. He didn't brag about me. If anyone asked, he'd roll his eyes and say, "Ray's at the academy. We'll see how long that lasts." The letters I got from home made it clear. Mom was proud. Valerie was mocking. And Dad didn't believe in me. Perfect fuel. I took every sneer, every doubt, and shoved it into my checklist binder like ammo. One of the hardest days came when we had to do the obstacle course blindfolded, guided only by our squad mates' instructions. My turn came, and my squad's shouting turned into chaos. Left, right, crawl, climb, they contradicted each other until I slammed into a wall. My knees were scraped raw, and I heard the instructor laughing. Something snapped. I stopped listening and fell back on the mental checklist I'd practiced for days. Hand placement, knee up, swing leg, shift weight. I made it over every obstacle while they yelled nonsense. When I pulled the blindfold off at the end, the instructor wasn't laughing anymore. He just nodded and walked away. That night, one of my squad mates asked, "How the hell did you do that?" I shrugged. Checklists. He rolled his eyes, but the next day, he came by and asked me to walk him through it. Slowly, word spread that I wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but if you wanted to not screw up, you came to me. By the end of my academy years, I'd built a reputation as the quiet one with the plans that actually worked. Nobody was lining up to take photos with me like they did with Valerie back home. But I had something better: respect from the people sweating next to me in the mud. Graduation came, and I stood there in my uniform with my classmates. Dad didn't show. Valerie had some community event she couldn't miss. Mom came, sitting alone in the bleachers, clapping until her hands were red. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered, "I told you you're not like her. And that's your strength." I held on to that, tighter than the diploma they handed me. When it was time to choose my path, I didn't go where people expected. I wasn't trying to be a pilot or a ship's captain. I signed up for Naval Special Warfare, Intelligence Division, the one place where the boring details, the unglamorous prep work, the checklists that no one else cared about, actually kept people alive. I could almost hear Valerie laughing in the back of my mind. Paperwork, figures. She didn't understand. Hell, Dad didn't either. But I knew. I'd found the one thing I was built for. And it wasn't applause or parades. The first weeks in Naval Special Warfare felt like Annapolis on steroids. The training wasn't designed to make you stronger, it was designed to make you break. I knew going in that I wasn't the fastest or strongest, so I leaned on the only thing I had: lists, details, the small things that no one cared about until they mattered. During a dawn ruck march, one guy forgot to tape his feet and ended up with blisters so bad he had to drop out. I'd written a checklist the night before: socks, tape, hydration, blister kit. Mine were taped up like I was going to war with my own boots. While others limped, I kept walking. Not because I was tougher, because I was prepared. The instructors noticed. Not in a good job way, there's no such thing in that world. But in the way they stopped yelling at me quite as much. That was its own reward. They were looking for people who wouldn't quit and who could keep a team alive under pressure. Being the quiet one with the boring habits suddenly wasn't a weakness anymore. One night, our squad got assigned a navigation drill. We had to move through swamp terrain in total darkness, find markers, and make it back before dawn. The squad leader was confident, said he didn't need a map. I followed, biting my tongue as we stumbled off course. Hours passed, and we were lost. The guys started panicking, cursing at each other. I pulled the laminated notes from my pocket, my own hand-drawn map, and a step-by-step checklist of bearings. "Give me 5 minutes," I told them. Nobody listened until we circled the same tree twice. Then the leader barked, "Fine, you try it." I guided us back by counting paces and checking bearings. We stumbled out of the swamp, covered in muck, just as the sun cracked the horizon. The instructors didn't smile, but they didn't have to. Everyone in my squad looked at me differently after that. They didn't say thank you, not out loud, but when we packed gear the next day, a couple of them started copying my notes. That was the moment I realized the boring part of me. The part Valerie always mocked was the reason I was going to make it. She could run fast, she could look good in a uniform, but none of that saved you when you were knee-deep in swamp water with no idea where north was. As weeks turned into months, I got assigned more responsibility with the intel side of things. That meant prepping mission packets, analyzing terrain, identifying threats. To most people, it looked like paperwork. To me, it was survival. I knew that a missed detail on a map could mean someone stepping on an IED. I knew that a sloppy timeline could get a team trapped. So I treated every document like it was a live weapon. Of course, not everyone respected it. The SEAL guys wanted action. They wanted fast boats, loud guns, and adrenaline. I can't count how many times I heard, "Come on, Donovan, you're just pushing paper. Let the real operators handle the fighting." I didn't argue, I just kept working. During one training op, a squad ignored my risk assessment about a cliffside approach. They went anyway, confident they knew better. Midway up, loose rock gave way, and 2 men slipped, barely catching themselves. The op halted, and they came back shaken. My notes had warned about unstable rock. Nobody said a word to me, but after that, my binders started disappearing from my desk, borrowed overnight by the same guys who used to laugh at them. One of those guys was Jason Whitaker, a brand new SEAL who looked like he'd been carved straight out of a recruiting poster. Tall, broad, always first in the water and last out. He had the confidence of someone who'd never truly failed yet. He also had the arrogance to match. "What's with all the lists?" he asked me one night, flipping through my notebook like it was a comic book. "They keep you alive," I said flatly. He smirked. So do muscles. And do propin. A week later, during a complex training op, Jason almost led his squad into an ambush point marked on my packet. He froze when he saw the symbol, then rerouted. Afterward, he found me and shoved the packet back into my hands. I didn't die today. Guess your lists aren't complete garbage. That was as close to respect as I was going to get from him. By the end of my first year in naval special warfare, I had a reputation. To the outside world, I was the paper pusher. To the people who'd seen the other side of my notes, I was the one who quietly prevented disaster. Our team was tasked with clearing a compound suspected of harboring insurgents. The plan was straightforward, too straightforward in my opinion. I added a contingency in case of secondary explosives, marking out areas that looked suspicious on satellite imagery. The squad rolled their eyes. Paranoid Donovan, they called me. But when the breach happened, the first door went off with a hidden charge exactly where I'd marked. No one was killed because the team had rerouted at the last second using my notes. The insurgents had rigged it as a trap, and without the detour, the blast would have torn through half the squad. The first time I went home after those deployments, the house hadn't changed much. Same white siding, same flagpole out front, same old pickup parked at an angle that drove my mother crazy. But inside, you could feel the shift. Mom's energy wasn't what it used to be. She still tried to keep everything perfect, like the house was a stage, but her hands shook when she poured coffee. She greeted me with her usual warmth, pulling me into a hug that smelled like detergent and cinnamon. My father barely looked up from his chair. And Valerie? She strutted in like she owned the place. Fresh off a local award for service to the community, wearing that polished smile she used for cameras, she made sure to bring up her achievements before I even set down my bag. "Oh, you're back," she said, like I'd just returned from summer camp instead of a war zone. "Still doing the whole paper-pushing thing for the Navy? I swear, our tax dollars must be working overtime to cover your colored markers." I didn't answer. I just set my duffel down. My father chuckled under his breath. He thought Valerie was hilarious. My mother tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, but Valerie wasn't done. "You know," she said loudly, "folks around here always ask me how you're doing. I tell them you're working in, what's it called? Intelligence? But I also say don't expect too much. Ray's not exactly built for the heavy lifting. She's more like background support." I caught my father smiling, proud of her little performance. That was Valerie's trick. Cut you down in a way that looked like a joke. And if you reacted, you looked sensitive. If you stayed quiet, you looked weak. But this time, something shifted. My mother, who rarely challenged anyone, especially not in front of my father, spoke up. "Valerie, enough," she said firmly. "Your sister's work matters." That one sentence froze the room. Valerie looked stunned, like she'd been slapped. My father cleared his throat and muttered something about just teasing, but the tension didn't fade. Mom didn't elaborate, but she gave me a tired, worried look that said she knew more than she let on. A few weeks later, Mom's diagnosis came. Cancer. Aggressive. Suddenly, all the little things, the shaky hands, the weight loss, the way she'd avoid standing too long made sense. She downplayed it, said she'd fight it, said she'd be fine. But I'd seen enough battlefields to recognize the truth. The hardest part wasn't the illness itself, it was the way our family reacted. My father threw himself into routines, mowing the lawn twice a week, cleaning the garage, polishing his metals like they held the cure. Valerie? She used it for sympathy points, telling anyone who'd listen how hard it was being the responsible daughter who stayed close to home. Meanwhile, I drove back and forth every chance I got, often on no sleep, squeezing visits in between deployments. I sat with Mom during chemo, helped her with the bills, cooked when she was too weak. None of it mattered to Dad. He'd say things like, "Valerie already handled it," even when I'd spent hours doing the work. One night, when Mom was especially tired, she pulled me aside. "Don't let them define you," she whispered. "You've got a strength they can't see yet. They will one day." How? That hit harder than anything Valerie ever said. Because Mom didn't deal in flattery. She was a teacher. She believed in quiet truths, not empty encouragement. As her illness worsened, I took on more responsibility. Valerie still showed up for the photo ops, making sure everyone at church knew how much she was sacrificing. But when Mom had to be helped to the bathroom at 2 a.m., When the medication list had to be tracked, when meals had to be prepped, it was me. One afternoon, while Valerie was busy charming the neighbors, I caught Dad staring at me while I folded laundry. He looked almost guilty. "You don't have to do all that," he muttered. "Valerie's got it handled." I didn't even answer. I just kept folding. If he wanted to believe Valerie was the perfect daughter, fine. I wasn't there to compete for his approval anymore. The day Mom passed, the house felt smaller. People crowded in with casseroles, hugs, and condolences. My father stood stiff near the window, telling the same story over and over about how the big storm once knocked down the maple, but spared the flag. Valerie cried loudly, making sure everyone saw. I stayed in the kitchen, scrubbing pans because it was the only thing that kept me steady. That night, before I left, I sat by Mom's empty chair. I pressed my palm against the wood, remembering all the times she'd rubbed my back when Dad tore me down. Her last words to me still echoed, "Don't let them define you." I carried that back with me into service. Grief became another weight to carry, but it wasn't dead weight. It drove me harder. While Valerie basked in local admiration, I buried myself in the work intel briefs, field prep, training operators who didn't yet realize how much those boring checklists mattered. And that was the irony. The more Valerie painted herself as the golden daughter, the more my name started to carry weight where it actually mattered overseas, in briefing rooms, in whispered stories about missions that went right because someone, somewhere, had done the unglamorous work of thinking ahead. It didn't erase the sting of Dad's favoritism or Valerie's mockery, but it gave me something better than their shallow approval. It gave me purpose. And purpose has a way of turning into a weapon when people underestimate you. Orders came down for a deployment that would put me directly into the intelligence pipeline, supporting a SEAL team. It wasn't glamorous, I wasn't fast roping out of helicopters or charging into compounds. My job was to lay down the invisible foundation. Routes, maps, timing, contingency planning. The kind of thing no one cared about until it failed. The first time I briefed a full team, half the guys barely looked up from their energy drinks. They'd been doing this long enough to trust their instincts over anyone's slides. I didn't waste time trying to sound impressive. I kept it tight. Potential ambush points, alternate exfil routes, supply lines marked down to the minute. When I finished, one of the senior chiefs asked, "So what happens if we ignore all that and just go straight in?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then you'll need someone to write the casualty report, because I won't sugarcoat it afterward." That got a few raised eyebrows. Operators respect bluntness more than flattery. From then on, they started listening, if only to make sure I wasn't quietly predicting their funeral. Over time, the habit of checklists became part of my team's culture. We didn't just run through weapons checks and gear counts. We added mental checks, backup roles, and what-if scenarios. Boring? Yes. But boring is what keeps you alive when the unexpected shows up. On one mission in Iraq, my notes included an alternate egress route through a narrow alleyway. It wasn't the preferred option, too tight, too unpredictable, but I flagged it anyway. The main road was compromised when an IED went off early. Without hesitation, the squad leader barked, "Take the alley." They came out shaken but unscathed. Later, he admitted, "If you hadn't mapped that, we'd be calling in medevac." That was the beginning of respect. They still made jokes about my obsession with binders and markers, but they followed the notes. And when they followed them, they came home. The nickname Angel of Death started creeping in around then. At first, it was a dark joke from intercepted enemy chatter. Apparently, the insurgents believed someone in our orbit had a knack for predicting where bombs and ambushes would fail. They spat it out like an insult. "The Angel of Death is with them." The guys picked it up. Not in a flattering way, more like superstition. If I flagged a spot as dangerous, they avoided it. If I cleared a route, they walked it like it was blessed ground. I hated the nickname, but it spread faster than anything I could stop. Operators are like that. Once something sticks, it's permanent. I told Jason Whitaker, by then no longer the cocky rookie but a rising team leader, that I didn't want to be known by that name. He smirked. "Then stop keeping us alive. Otherwise, too bad you're stuck with it." Jason was different by then. He'd seen enough nights go sideways to realize instinct wasn't enough. He became one of my biggest advocates, quietly reminding younger guys to pay attention to my packets. "If she says, tape your boots, don't be stupid." Hearing him say it mattered more than any award ever could. The first time someone used the nickname in front of me, I was in a dusty tent halfway across the world. A young operator, barely old enough to buy a beer back home, was staring at one of my maps like it had cursed him. He traced a circle around a spot I'd flagged as avoid at all costs, then shook his head. "You're like some kind of angel of death," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. Laughter followed. Not cruel, just the nervous kind men use when superstition starts to feel real. I told him to find another joke. He shrugged and went back to packing his gear, but the damage was done. The name spread like wildfire. At first, it irritated me. I didn't want to be seen as a symbol, especially not one tied to death. I wasn't pulling triggers or throwing grenades. My work was about keeping people breathing. But to the teams, the nickname wasn't about me, it was about survival. In their eyes, if I pointed out a danger, it meant death was near. And if I cleared something, it meant they'd probably live through it. The strangest part was watching hardened men guys who'd survived more than their share of firefights start treating my packets like scripture. They'd tease me to my face, but when it came time to plan, they'd quietly hover around my desk, making sure they had the latest updates. Jason leaned into it more than anyone. By then, he was a team leader, running missions and mentoring rookies. He'd joke, "If the angel of death says don't go left, we're not going left." It was half humor, half dead serious. His authority carried weight, and once he endorsed the superstition, it became culture. I still remember one mission that cemented it. The target was a bomb maker operating out of a compound that had been raided twice before without success. The guy was slippery, paranoid, and had a reputation for setting traps. My analysis showed a pattern. Every time he left, he used a back alley, not the main road. I flagged it, added contingencies, and insisted on covering that alley. Half the room scoffed. "Too risky," they said. "He'll see us coming." Jason cut them off. "If she marked it, we cover it." That was the end of the debate. Sure enough, when the target bolted, it wasn't through the front door. He ran straight into the alley, right into the squad lying in wait. The capture went clean. No fireworks, no casualties. Back at base, Jason grinned and slapped the map down on my desk. Angel of Death strikes again. I didn't argue, but I hated how natural it sounded coming from him. The name was becoming bigger than me, and there was no way to stop it. What bothered me most wasn't the nickname. It was what it implied. People assumed I had some mystical sense, like I could see death coming. The truth was simpler and less glamorous. I paid attention to details they ignored. Patterns, habits, terrain features, even the way a street dog barked on surveillance footage, it all told a story. I just wrote it down and forced myself to believe the boring stuff mattered. But once the legend took root, it changed how people treated me. Operators who once dismissed me now deferred to me. Commanders started inviting me into rooms I hadn't been in before. Suddenly, my word carried weight not because I had rank, but because I had a reputation. Not everyone liked it. Some resented the idea that a woman in an intel role, someone who never kicked down doors, was earning a name whispered with respect. One officer sneered openly, calling me a mascot with a binder. I ignored him. A week later, his squad used one of my contingency routes to avoid an ambush. After that, he kept his mouth shut. Still, the burden of the nickname weighed on me. Every time I flagged a route, I worried I was wrong. Every time I cleared one, I worried I'd missed something. If I was the so-called angel of death, then one mistake would prove it true in the worst possible way. I carried that anxiety quietly. On the outside, I was calm, methodical, even dry. On the inside, I second-guessed every line I drew. Jason picked up on it. One night, he caught me staring at a map long after everyone else had gone. "You're not a fortune teller," he said flatly. "You're not supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to give us a chance, and you do." Thus, I wanted to argue, but he was right. I wasn't chasing perfection. I was chasing survival percentages. Over time, I accepted that the nickname wasn't going away. Instead of fighting it, I redirected it. If the teams believed I had some grim power, fine. I used that belief to make them respect the boring details. When I said double-check your batteries, they did. When I said reroute through a drainage ditch, they didn't complain. If fear of the angel of death kept them alive, I could live with that. Back home, of course, Valerie had no clue. She was still parading around as the pride of the Donovan family, collecting her small-town honors and cutting ribbons at parades. To her, I was just the sister who filed papers somewhere overseas. She didn't know that men twice my size and 10 times my bravado whispered my nickname with a mix of dread and respect. I didn't bother correcting her. Explaining it would have been pointless. Valerie wasn't wired to understand the kind of quiet work that saves lives without making headlines. She was wired for applause. But out in the field, I didn't need applause. I had something better: trust. And trust, once earned in that world, is stronger than any medal or speech. The mission that broke me wasn't the loudest or the bloodiest. It was supposed to be routine, a hit on a safe house in a valley we'd worked a dozen times before. I'd pored over satellite imagery, drawn overlays, and built in 3 fallback routes. It looked solid. The team trusted it. Jason gave me his usual nod before stepping off. That quiet acknowledgement that meant he believed in the plan. Everything unraveled faster than I could process. The convoy had barely cleared the ridge when the first RPG streaked out of the tree line. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Within seconds, small arms fire lit up the valley. Comms filled with shouting. Men trying to stick to protocol while chaos swallowed it whole. I snapped into motion, grabbing the backup frequencies, cross-checking with surveillance feeds, shouting alternate pivots into the headset. "Route Bravo now, keep the ridge between you and the fire." My hands shook so hard I had to press them flat against the map table just to steady my voice. The team fought their way out, but not clean. One man didn't come back. Not because of negligence, not because of laziness, because the enemy had been smarter that night. They'd studied us, adapted, waited for the pattern, and I hadn't seen it coming. Back at base, the silence was heavier than the gunfire had been. Jason found me sitting alone in the ops tent, staring at the same sheet of paper I'd written the plan on. My pen was still in my hand, the ink smudged from sweat. "You can't carry all of it," he said quietly. I didn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed. All I could see was the moment comms went dead, the gap where a voice should have been. He crouched next to me. "Listen, without your fallback routes, we'd have lost half the team. That's the math. You saved more than you lost." I wanted to believe him. But in my head, the equation was simpler. One man dead was still one too many. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the RPGs launch, felt the ground shake, saw the blank space where a name used to be on the roster. I obsessed over my checklists, rewriting them, adding new contingencies, searching for the flaw that had slipped through. The others noticed. One young operator handed me his notebook before a mission and said, "Can you just mark it up like you always do? I don't care if you call it boring. It helps me breathe." His voice cracked when he said it. That cut deeper than any insult Valerie had ever thrown my way. These men weren't looking at me like a paper pusher anymore. They were looking at me like their lives depended on me holding it together. I realized then that my grief couldn't paralyze me. It had to fuel me. If I couldn't bring that man back, the least I could do was make damn sure no one else went down the same way. So I added more. I built a soft fails list, small weaknesses we could live with if they cracked. Things like backup pumps or secondary generators. And I built a hard fails list, the ones that would kill us if ignored. Every plan from then on had both columns. The guys rolled their eyes at first, but when the soft fails list caught a faulty piece of gear before it collapsed on a mission, they stopped complaining. Rituals grew from it. Knock twice before leaving the room. To remind yourself the checklist wasn't just paperwork, it was survival. Say one boring detail out loud before stepping off, because boring details are the ones that keep you breathing. Jason backed me up at every turn. He didn't coddle me, didn't pat me on the shoulder, he just enforced it. If a rookie groaned about the new rules, Jason shut it down. "You don't like it? Then don't come crying when you're dead. Donovan's lists keep you alive. Do them." That support carried me, even when the weight threatened to crush me. Meanwhile, the burden of the nickname grew heavier. After the failed mission, Angel of Death sounded less like a superstition and more like a curse. I hated hearing it, whispered in chow lines, scribbled on whiteboards, passed around like it was gospel. But to the men, it wasn't an insult. It was respect. Twisted, maybe, but real. They weren't calling me that because I doomed them. They were calling me that because Even when plans failed, I gave them a chance. At night, lying in my bunk, I thought about how Valerie would have spun it. She would have taken the nickname and run with it, plastered it on social media, turned it into a brand. I did the opposite. I never said it out loud, never acknowledged it. I let it exist in the shadows, because that's where it belonged. But shadows or not, the truth was this. Failure had changed me. I was no longer the woman just trying to prove herself against a sister's mockery or a father's indifference. I was the woman carrying the weight of lives, one line item at a time. I didn't get to grieve in peace. There were no days off, no timeouts for emotional recovery. The next mission was always coming. The enemy didn't care about my nightmares, and the men trusted me too much to let me fall apart. So I kept going. Pen to paper, routes drawn, risks flagged. Every page was a promise. Every checklist was a vow that I'd never let complacency kill another man. And deep down, I knew something else. Valerie could laugh all she wanted. My father could dismiss me until the day he died. But the men who walked back through the wire alive didn't care about small-town awards or family approval. They cared that I'd given them another sunrise. The first time I stood in front of a classroom full of young operators, I thought about how much I would have hated me at their age. 20-somethings full of muscle, adrenaline, and cocky smiles. Most of them figured they were bulletproof. The last thing they wanted was some intel officer telling them about boring checklists. I didn't bother trying to win them over. I started with a blunt truth. You can be the strongest guy in this room, but if you skip the boring parts, the ocean will eat you alive, and the desert will finish what's left. That got a few laughs, but they were nervous laughs. Good. They needed to feel that edge. The first lessons were ugly. They rushed through briefs, skipped steps, acted like they already knew everything. Jason sat in the back during one of those sessions, arms crossed, watching them trip over their own arrogance. When one kid sped through a checklist in under 30 seconds, Jason barked, "Do it again. And this time, do it like you give a damn whether you breathe tomorrow." That was the turning point. The room snapped to attention. They realized this wasn't about making me happy, it was about survival. I drilled them hard. If they forgot a step, we restarted. If they skipped a boring detail, I made them explain why it didn't matter. Most of the time, they couldn't. And slowly, the light bulbs went on. They began to see that the rituals weren't busy work. They were scaffolding for survival. Jason took to the methods fast. He didn't just follow them, he lived them. His squad adopted the habit of knocking twice on a table before heading out, a reminder that they'd gone through the checklist. It started as a joke, then turned into culture. By the time new recruits arrived, it was so ingrained that no one questioned it. The real test came when Jason's team ran an exercise simulating a hostage rescue. They were given incomplete intel and had to improvise under pressure. Midway through, their comms glitched. I watched from the control room as panic started to creep in. Jason froze for a second, then pulled out the laminated card I'd given him a backup checklist. He went step by step, calm, precise. His squad followed. They finished the exercise faster and cleaner than anyone expected. When they came back, Jason didn't brag. He just looked at me and said, "The boring parts work." That was the moment I knew the culture had shifted. It wasn't just me anymore. The methods had spread beyond my hands. They were in Jason's voice, in the knock on the table, in the way rookies stopped rolling their eyes when we talked about redundancies. But influence comes with pressure. The more the rituals spread, the more I felt like one mistake would topple the whole system. If I slipped, the men would lose faith, and faith was half the battle. I carried that weight in silence. Still, seeing the change in those young operators kept me steady. One kid from Louisiana scribbled a thank you note on the back of his training manual. "Your checklists kept my head from lying to me." Another wrote, "I sleep now." Thanks. Those scraps of paper were worth more than any medal. Of course, outside the teams, none of it mattered. Back home, Valerie was still the face of service. She had no idea what it meant to shape culture in rooms that smelled like sweat, oil, and nerves. She thought leadership was standing at a podium. I knew it was convincing a 9-year-old to tape his boots before they bled. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was adored for parades. I was respected in silence. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Respect that comes from survival doesn't fade with applause. Still, I couldn't shake the weight of the failures. Every time a kid looked at me like I held the answers, I remembered the night in the valley when one man didn't come back. I wondered if I was building them up just to watch one more name fall off the roster. That doubt never left, it just became part of the job. Jason noticed the toll. He started staying later after briefs, lingering in the hallway like he had something to say. One night, he finally did. "You don't have to be perfect," he told me. "You just have to be consistent. The rest will take care of itself." I didn't argue. He was right. Perfection is a myth. Consistency is survival. So I kept at it. Day after day, class after class, drill after drill. We rewrote training blocks to focus on the after effects the week after a firefight, when adrenaline fades and the silence gets loud. We taught men to ask each other, "How's your air?" Not as a metaphor, but as a literal question. Can you breathe? Are you steady? Are you carrying something too heavy? At first the idea was mocked, but then it saved a kid who was drowning in silence, and nobody mocked it again. Culture doesn't shift with big speeches. It shifts with small habits that catch on. Watching those rookies grow, watching Jason step into real leadership, I realized something. Valerie could have her trophies, Dad could have his medals, but I was shaping something that outlasted both, a way of surviving that belonged to all of us. And when I heard Jason's squad knocking twice before mission, I didn't think about superstition. I thought about my mother's last words, "Don't let them define you." I wasn't letting them. I was defining myself, one boring checklist at a time. When I came home for a short leave, I expected the usual quiet meals with Dad pretending my work didn't exist, Valerie making sure the whole town knew she was the golden child, and me slipping in and out without drawing attention. What I didn't expect was how brazen Valerie had become. There was a local fundraiser at the Civic Center, packed with townspeople, retired officers, and the kind of politicians who showed up just long enough to get their pictures taken. Valerie was front and center, shaking hands like she was running for office. Dad stood nearby, beaming at her like she'd just won the Medal of Honor. I tried to stay in the background, but that never worked with Valerie. She spotted me by the coffee urn and made a beeline, dragging half the room's attention with her. "Well, look who decided to show up," she announced loudly, patting my shoulder like I was some charity case. "Fresh off filing her papers for the Navy, huh? Tell me, Ray, do they give you ribbons for the best stapler usage? Or do you just get a certificate?" The crowd chuckled, the way people do when they're not sure if it's a joke or an insult. My father smirked, proud as ever of his eldest daughter's wit. I kept my face steady. Years of intel briefings had trained me not to flinch in hostile rooms. "I'll let you know," I said, right after they give you a medal for attendance. That earned a few laughs that weren't hers. Valerie's smile faltered, just for a second, before she plastered it back on. She wasn't used to me firing back. Later that night, while people mingled, she cornered me near the exit. "You think being overseas makes you special?" she hissed, keeping her voice low enough for only me. "Nobody here cares what you do. They care about who shows up. And that's me. You'll always be the ghost sister." It stung, but not for the reason she thought. It stung because she was right about one thing. Most of the town didn't understand what I did. They understood Valerie's speeches and parades, not my binders and late nights in tents that smelled like sweat and diesel. But what she didn't get, what she couldn't get, was that I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for the men who knocked twice on a table before heading into danger, because they believed my boring details gave them a better shot at walking out. Still, her words stuck in my head. Ghost sister. That was how my father saw me too. The invisible one. The support act. Valerie's foil. The family drama didn't stop there. A few days later, Dad hosted a barbecue, inviting half the neighborhood. He used the chance to brag about Valerie's latest achievement, a community service award for organizing care packages. When someone asked about me, he waved it off. "She just does paperwork for the Navy. Valerie's the one carrying the family's name." I stood there with a plate of ribs in my hand, smiling politely while every neighbor nodded along. My chest burned, but I didn't say a word. Not because I was weak, but because I knew better than to argue with a man who'd already written the story in his head. That night, Mom's absence hit me harder than usual. She would have cut through the noise with a quiet word, reminded me not to let them define me. Without her, it felt like I was fighting shadows. The next morning, I laced up my running shoes and hit the pavement. Every stride felt like a reminder. I wasn't running from them. I was running for myself. Valerie could have the spotlight, Dad could have his pride. I had something they didn't proof. Proof written in after-action reports, in men who came home breathing, in rookies who finally understood why boring habits mattered. But small towns love spectacle more than substance. Valerie basked in it, feeding off the applause. She didn't care that it was shallow. She cared that it was loud. And my father, he loved her loudness because it reflected his own need for recognition. What neither of them realized was that recognition outside the family was already shifting. I was starting to get invited to rooms where generals listened, not because they wanted to, but because my work forced them to. They couldn't ignore the survival rates tied to my methods. They couldn't dismiss the reputation that had taken on a life of its own. Yet at home, none of that mattered. At home, I was still the ghost sister, and Valerie loved reminding me. One afternoon, she stopped by Dad's house while I was visiting. She waltzed in, dropped her purse on the counter, and said, "So, Ray, when are you finally going to do something worth bragging about? Or are you content being invisible forever?" I didn't rise to it. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and said calmly, "Invisible doesn't mean irrelevant. Ask the men who came back alive because of my work." "Oh wait, you can't. You don't know them." The room went quiet. Dad looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't. Valerie's face turned red, and for once, she didn't have a comeback. That silence was worth more than any applause. Family revenge stories don't always happen with shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, they happen in the quiet moments, when truth lands harder than any insult. Valerie thrived on cutting me down in public, but slowly, the cracks were forming. People noticed the way she overplayed her hand. People noticed the way she sneered while I stood steady. And one day, those cracks would split wide open. For now, I didn't need to win the town. I didn't need to win Dad. I just needed to keep showing up where it mattered, even if that meant being the ghost sister. The night at the Midwest Military Honors Hall wasn't supposed to be about me. It was a community event, a chance to honor veterans across generations. The hall smelled like floor wax and burned coffee, with flags hanging from brass poles and folding chairs lined up tight. Men in ball caps and women with ribbons on their blouses shuffled in, carrying the weight of service in their posture. I slipped into the back row, content to sit quietly. The walls were lined with photos of soldiers who had come home and those who hadn't. It wasn't my kind of stage. It was Valerie's. And of course she was there, dressed sharp, flashing her practice smile. My father stood tall beside her, chest puffed out like he was still wearing medals. When the crowd settled, Valerie made her move. She raised her voice just enough to carry, pointing at me across the room. "Oh, look who finally decided to join us. My little sister, the Navy's favorite secretary. She files paperwork so well, doesn't she?" Laughter rippled through the hall. My father didn't stop her. In fact, he leaned in, adding fuel. "Valerie served on the front line," he boomed, clamping a hand on the shoulder of a seasoned SEAL standing beside him. "You push paper 1,000 miles from the fight. Now this is a real warrior." The room shifted. Some nodded, others murmured. Their eyes slid past me, as if I were just an empty chair. It was a familiar script. Valerie shining, Dad backing her, me fading into the background. But the SEAL didn't smile. He didn't puff his chest. Instead, he turned, eyes locking on me. His throat bobbed like he'd swallowed gravel. And in a voice low but clear enough to cut through the hum of ceiling fans, he asked, "Are you the angel of death?" The air went still. Veterans straightened in their seats. A widow in the front row whispered, "She's somebody." My father's jaw tightened, confusion flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected that. He didn't understand why the words carried weight that bent the room around me. Valerie blinked, her smile faltering. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding the spotlight. Jason took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said louder now, voice steady, "you ran the webs at Al-Rashid. You flagged the traps in Al-Noor. You kept us breathing. I owe you birthdays." It wasn't boasting. It was testimony. The kind of raw acknowledgement that men in uniform don't hand out lightly. The room absorbed his words. A Vietnam vet stood, his jacket rustling. He didn't salute, but he pressed his hand over his heart. Another followed, then another. A wave of recognition rippled across the hall, not noisy, not forced, just quiet bodies answering truth with respect. My father tried to regain control. "She files papers," he muttered, half to himself, half to the room that had always let him define me. "With respect, sir," Jason cut in, steel under his tone. "She doesn't file. She keeps us alive. There's a difference." Valerie's face flushed red. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound died halfway out of her throat. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. They weren't even with my father. They were with the truth standing in front of them. A cousin near the back spoke softly, but the words carried. "Uncle Frank, I think maybe you don't know everything." Silence hung heavy, but it wasn't awkward. It was corrective. It was the sound of a room rewriting its own story. The master of ceremonies, a woman who'd bandaged half the town's playground scrapes decades ago, didn't even bother reaching for the microphone. She let the moment stand. Sometimes silence does more than speeches. When people finally stirred, they didn't turn back to Valerie. They turned to me. Not for explanations, not for details, just acknowledgement. For once, I wasn't invisible. My father stared at the flag on the wall, his old shield. His mouth opened, then closed again. He had no script for this. The room had changed its mind, and he couldn't change it back. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. I simply said, "I came here to sit among people who understand cost." That was it. No performance, no grandstanding, just truth. The truth was enough. People approached me after, not with fanfare, but with quiet words. "We're proud of you," one neighbor said. His wife added, "Always were." A veteran shook my hand without introducing himself, as if the gesture was its own language. Even Dad drifted closer. His eyes looked different, less like a judge, more like a man trying to read instructions in a language he should have learned years ago. His voice cracked when he said, "If any of this is true, why didn't you tell me?" I met his gaze. "Because you never asked." He heard the rest without me saying it. That silence was our reckoning. Jason broke the tension with a minor salute, lifting his cup. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "thank you for the boring checklists." The crowd chuckled softly. But it wasn't mockery, it was respect. My father stood there, shoulders sagging, pride crumbling into something raw. He muttered only 4 words, but they landed heavier than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. "I expected a son." I didn't soften it. I didn't absolve him. I just answered, "Wrong expectation." End of fray. For once, he had nothing to add. The hall carried on with the scheduled honors, but nothing was the same. The room had already shifted. The narrative had already been rewritten. After the night at the honors hall, word spread fast. Small towns don't need newspapers to circulate a story. Front porches and diner counters work faster than any press. People who'd once only seen me as Valerie's quiet shadow started looking at me differently. Not with pity, not with applause, but with respect. The next morning, Dad couldn't even finish his usual coffee at the kitchen table. He sat there, stirring sugar he'd already added, like the spoon was the only thing keeping his hands steady. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Finally," he said, "the way that Seal spoke about you." His voice trailed off, like he didn't know where the sentence was supposed to land. If it's true, I was wrong. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let him wrestle with it. For decades, he'd measured me against a bar that never existed, one Valerie had raised with showmanship and shallow approval. Now, for the first time, he was realizing his scale had been broken all along. "I wanted you to be like her," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought she was the strong one. I thought—" He shook his head. "Turns out, I didn't see anything." The confession didn't feel like victory. It felt like overdue honesty. I wasn't interested in rubbing it in. "You saw what you wanted to see," I told him. "But truth doesn't bend just because you ignore it." His eyes dropped to his cup. "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't," I said simply. "You just stop making the same mistake twice." That was the closest thing to forgiveness I could offer. Meanwhile, Valerie didn't fade quietly. She doubled down, showing up at church luncheons and county events with even bigger smiles, louder speeches, and exaggerated stories about her contributions. But cracks were visible now. People tilted their heads when she spoke, whispering afterward instead of applauding as blindly as before. At one fundraiser, I overheard a woman mutter, "She sure talks a lot about herself." Didn't her sister get called the angel of death? Valerie caught the words too. Her jaw tightened, but she smiled wider, pretending it didn't sting. For me, none of it required revenge, in the traditional sense. I didn't need to out-yell her or humiliate her. The truth was louder than anything she could manufacture. She'd built her reputation on pageantry. Mine had been built on blood, sweat, and survival. Eventually, the weight of authenticity tips the scales. Even Jason noticed the shift when I rotated back stateside for a stretch. We met for coffee in a cramped diner near base, and he smirked over his mug. Heard you finally got recognized back home. Bet Valerie's losing her mind. I rolled my eyes. Recognition isn't the point. Maybe not, he said, but it doesn't hurt to let the record show who was actually carrying the weight. He wasn't wrong. For once, the record was correcting itself. The strangest change was in Dad. He started asking questions, real ones. Not loaded comments or dismissive asides, but actual questions. What does it mean when you say fallback routes? How do you even spot an ambush from a satellite photo? He wasn't suddenly soft, but he was trying. That was new. I answered plainly, never sugarcoating, never turning it into a lecture. If he wanted to understand, he could start by listening. And to his credit, he did. One evening, after Valerie had stormed out of the house in a huff, angry that Dad hadn't praised her latest speech enough, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. I think I made her this way, he admitted. Always feeding her praise, never holding her accountable. I didn't disagree. Valerie's need for validation wasn't born from nowhere. Dad had built her pedestal, then blamed me for not climbing onto it. She's an adult now, I said evenly. She chooses who she is. That's on her. His eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. And you chose better, even when I didn't give you a reason to. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't wrapped in apologies. But they were enough. For once, I wasn't invisible at my own table. In the weeks that followed, Valerie's shine dimmed. People weren't hostile to her. They just weren't impressed anymore. The same jokes she'd made about me didn't land the way they used to. The same smiles looked more like masks. And without the applause, she seemed smaller. That was the revenge I never planned, letting the truth stand taller than her pride. I didn't change for her. I didn't chase approval from Dad. I just kept doing the work that mattered, work that didn't need parades or speeches. And in the end, that was enough to turn the tide. Life after the honors hall and the quiet shift at home didn't slow down. The Navy never pauses. Orders kept coming, missions kept cycling, and I stayed in the rhythm of maps, packets, and endless checklists. Some people burned out on the grind. For me, it was fuel. Every boring line I wrote, every redundant backup I insisted on, meant another shot at survival. Jason's squad carried the habits like scripture. I'd walk past a ready room and hear the knock twice, solid before they headed out. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was culture. And it reminded me that what I built would outlast me. These weren't just my methods now. They belonged to all of us. When younger operators asked where the rituals came from, Jason never made it about me. He just said, "We learned the hard way. Trust the boring parts." That was enough. Legends don't need names stamped on them, they need results. Back home, Valerie still tried to claw her way back into the spotlight. She gave louder speeches, posed for more photos, even hinted at running for local office. But the applause wasn't the same. People saw through the performance now. She was still loud, but louder doesn't always mean stronger. Dad changed too, though in small, awkward steps. He asked questions about deployments, about checklists, about what Angel of Death really meant. Sometimes he struggled with the answers, but he listened. That was more than he'd done in decades. One afternoon, while fixing the old fence out back, he finally set it straight. "I spent years trying to make you into Valerie. Turns out you were the one I should have been proud of all along." His voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't take it back. I didn't give him absolution. I just said, "Then start acting like it." He nodded. No excuses, no backpedaling. Just a man realizing too late that his scoreboard had been wrong. Mom's absence still lingered, especially in those moments. She would have loved watching Valerie squirm under the weight of truth. She would have loved watching Dad finally admit his blindness. But more than anything, she would have been proud that I'd chosen my own definition of strength. Out in the field, the nickname followed me everywhere. Angel of Death. At first it felt like a curse. Then it became superstition. Now, it was simply shorthand for survival. The guys trusted it, and trust is currency in war. I never embraced it, never branded myself with it, but I stopped running from it too. If it kept men alive, if it forced them to double-check their gear or reroute at the right time, then the name had value. Not because it was dramatic, but because it worked. That's the difference between honor and pride. Valerie chased pride. She wanted eyes on her, applause in her ears, headlines in the paper. Pride fades. Honor doesn't. Honor is lived, not announced. I thought about that one night while packing up after another training cycle. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after weeks of noise. I slid my notes into a binder and caught myself whispering something Mom once told me. Don't let them define you. She'd been right. They'd tried Dad with his favoritism, Valerie with her mockery, even the Navy with its dismissals early on. But I hadn't let them. I'd defined myself, not with speeches or trophies, but with work that lasted longer than applause. That's the heart of family revenge stories. It's not about yelling louder or hitting harder. It's about letting truth stand taller than pride. My revenge wasn't humiliating Valerie in front of the town. It wasn't even making Dad eat his words. It was building something so undeniable that their words stopped mattering. Respect is logistics. Honor is a verb. Revenge is letting the truth stand taller than pride. And when Jason's squad knocked twice on a doorframe before stepping into the unknown, I knew my work had already outlived me.